There's a complicated dance that we're often doing when we stand here at this pulpit. We want to be intentional about sharing important ideas and practices that can help us keep growing into the beloved community. We also want to speak from an awareness of what is happening in the world and our responsibility to act and live in a way that embodies a commitment to compassion and justice. It's not easy to choose what to leave out, and as you know, sometimes I try to say too much, but this is one of those moments in history when important news and ongoing crises often demand a response. And it's been one of those weeks. So Roger's going to address one of the recent egregious displays of racism in Trump's America during the communion meditation, and I'm going to go off topic for a few minutes to say something more about the human rights crisis that continues to unfold along the border and in concentration camps and detention facilities across the nation. Because this week, amidst ongoing protests and direct actions, Trump announced his solution to reducing the number of asylum seekers seeking entry into the United States. His solution is simply to change the rules so that most people can't seek asylum. These are drastic changes, and lawsuits are already being filed. As Lee Geller, deputy director of the Immigrants' Rights Project at the ACLU, explained, quote, "The Trump administration is trying to unilaterally reverse our country's legal and moral commitment to protect those who are fleeing danger. This new rule is patently unlawful, and we will sue swiftly," end quote. But I want us to notice this as another example both of Trump's cruelty and underhandedness. Notice there's no move here to address the underlying issues that create a refugee crisis. Instead, Trump is just changing the rules so that seeking asylum is more difficult and even illegal. The cry from the right has always been, we don't mind immigrants, we don't mind refugees. When? As long as they come here legally. But these kinds of moves show that for the lie that it is. Seeking asylum was legal, but they still hated refugees. That's why Eleanor Acer, Senior Director for Refugee Protection at Human Rights First, said this: "The president can't stand the fact that seeking protection in the United States is legal, so he's doing everything he can to make the asylum process as difficult as possible." These stories remind us of why we need to pay attention every day to what is happening in the news, to support organizations working for change with our time and money, and participate in vigils and protests and actions that let the world know that we will not stand idly by, especially when news breaks, as it did in Springfield this week, that ICE will be opening our own processing center here in this city. We need to be asking ourselves every day, what am I doing to be part of the movement that brings about an end to the concentration camps? Who is protecting the folks who are committing these atrocities? And who is profiting from migrant detention? And how can we impact their public image and profit margins so that they are forced to stop? What am I doing today to bring freedom, resources, and healing to more than 50,000 people who are currently being held in ICE facilities, to the approximately 20,000 more people who are being held in customs and border protection centers, and to the more than 11,000 children who are now in the custody of Health and Human Services? My reflections this morning are not directly related to this crisis, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be reflecting and acting on this issue this morning and every morning in a way that can bring an end to this nightmare of injustice and inhumanity. In other news, it's probably difficult that you have not heard a name mentioned lately. I'm guessing that you, like me, have been horrified by the stories and accusations told about Jeffrey Epstein. The new stories are consistent with the old stories, and in case you don't know the history, Epstein pleaded guilty in June of 2008 to a single charge of soliciting prostitution from children. That plea was a calculated one. It was part of a deal that granted Epstein immunity to other charges, and most importantly, it closed an FBI investigation that was, in the words of one reporter, yielding more victims and evidence of a possible sex trafficking conspiracy beyond Palm Beach. As Julie Brown of the Miami Herald reported, those victims included 80 people who say they were molested or otherwise sexually abused by Epstein between 2001 and 2006. We should probably also note that though Trump is now denying that he knows anything about that Epstein person, back in 2002, and take note of that date, the investigation was from 2001 to 2006, right? In 2002, Trump considered it a point of pride to know Jeffrey Epstein. In one statement he gave to the media, he said, "I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with." And this is very disturbing to me, but he said, "It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." No doubt about it, Jeffrey enjoys his social life. End quote. There's a lot that needs to be said here, from the way that Epstein avoided punishment in 2008 by serving a light sentence in the Palm Beach County Stockade with his own security detail and with work release, he could continue his employment, and what all that says about our criminal justice system, to the way that the Epstein case is related to and impacts the important progress being made by the Me Too movement, to the significance of the resignation of U.S. Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta because of the way he mishandled the Epstein case in 2008. Like the concentration camps on the southern border, Epstein's story reveals a whole lot about the society in which we live in. And those stories are not accidents. These situations are the bad fruit, the inevitable consequences of a society that's built upon imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And the power and privilege accrued by those who have benefited from those systems is in turn used to protect those systems, even when it means tolerating and protecting men like Jeffrey Epstein or a man like Donald Trump for years, decades, even lifetimes. One of the key components of these oppressive systems is the lack of empathy and compassion on the part of those in power. We're trained to believe, I think socially, that people like Jeffrey Epstein, they're exceptions, right? They're unusual. And for those of us who are empathetic, it seems impossible to even imagine how someone could treat another human being that way, how they could reduce another human being to an object. That folks like Epstein could engage in this kind of behavior for decades seems beyond belief. How could you do that? How could you live with yourself? But here we are, week after week, recounting the multitude of ways that humans do just that. And here we are, week after week, recounting the many ways that human minds can justify horrible decisions, including unjust and violent acts. Those psychological loopholes provide plenty of opportunity for oppressive systems to organize, justify, and even profit, maybe especially profit, from dehumanizing, exploiting, traumatizing, and terrorizing other human beings. As it turns out, one of those psychosocial loopholes, one of those ways that oppressive systems can exploit, is the hoarding of wealth. It has created and empowered all sorts of injustice throughout human history. And these days, we also have the hard data to go with the history that helps us understand just how this works. The science is already comprehensive and it's persuasive. Studies have repeatedly shown that increased wealth leads to decreased empathy, that wealth can cloud moral judgment and lead to unethical behavior, that the wealthy people are more vulnerable to substance abuse issues, that the pursuit of wealth and spending of money can often be addictive and can even qualify as behavioral addictions, and that children in wealthy families are at high risk for anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, cheating, and stealing. And that's just a short list of impacts on wealthy folk who exist in a society that's built around income inequality. When a society becomes organized that way, though, around the accumulation of wealth and power, all sorts of other things begin to go wrong. As Daisy Gruhl in Scientific American puts it, it's tempting to think that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to act fairly. After all, if you already have enough for yourself, it's easier to think about what others may need. But research suggests the opposite is true. As people climb the social ladder, their compassionate feelings toward others decline. Given the growing income inequality in the United States, the relationship between wealth and compassion has important implications. Those who hold most of the power in this country, political and otherwise, tend to come from privileged backgrounds. The most powerful among us may be the least likely to make decisions that help the needy and the poor. They may also be the most likely to engage in unethical behavior. Although greed is a universal human emotion, it may have the strongest pull over those who already have the most. Since human beings and our motivations are complicated and complex, we can't make broad generalizations about why individual people do a specific thing. But the data does tell us that as a society, economic inequality has definite harmful impacts to everyone, the rich and the poor. And the greater the inequality, the more disconnection there is. Some of the most important research on the psychosocial impacts of inequality is being done by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Richard is a professor emeritus of social epidemiology at the University of Nottingham Medical School, and Kate is a professor at the University of York and a scientist with the United Kingdom's National Institute for Health Research. And I tell you that because I want you to understand this is mainstream science, mainstream research. They have, in their words, collected internationally comparable data from dozens of rich countries on health and as many social problems as they could find reliable figures for. What they discovered could be easily traded for the list of issues that we're addressing in our reflections and activities for the Vital Connections Conference that's coming up in August. They wrote, inequality is associated with lower life expectancy, higher rates of infant mortality, shorter height, poorer self-reported health, low birth weight, AIDS, and depression. It's further associated with level of trust, mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, life expectancy and infant mortality, obesity, children's educational performance, teenage births, homicides, imprisonment rates, and social mobility. Pickett and Wilkinson combined all of these factors together from each country to create an index of health and social problems. And if you look at their graphs, you'll notice time and again that nations with equality have better social health and nations with more inequality suffer. The United States is the example par excellence, with its data represented perhaps fittingly on the far right. It is sky high in both income inequality and, as a result, health and social problems. Commenting on this finding, Wilkinson and Pickett say this: the problems in rich countries are not caused by the society not being rich enough or being too rich, but by the material differences between people in that society. What matters is where we stand in relation to others in our own society. The importance of community, social cohesion, and solidarity to human well-being has been demonstrated repeatedly in research, showing how beneficial friendship and involvement in community life are to health. Equality, though, comes as a precondition for getting the other two right. Not only do large inequalities produce problems associated with social differences and divisive class prejudices that go with them, they also weaken community life, reduce trust, and increase violence, end quote. I think it's worth saying again, though, equality, including economic and maybe especially economic equality, is a precondition for getting community right. The problems in rich countries are not caused by a society not being rich enough, but by the material differences between people within each society being too big. What matters is where we stand in relation to each other. And just to put that even more plainly, the country on the far left here, Japan, What that means is the gap between the very poorest and the very wealthiest is smaller. It's still probably too big, right? But it's smaller. As you move up the graph, the gap between the most rich and the most poor gets bigger and bigger. And that's where the United States lands. And you wonder why we have such a problem having community with one another. We say we don't want a society that produces people like Jeffrey Epstein or Donald Trump. But people like Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump are what we will always get when we defend a society that promotes economic inequality. Fortunately, there's a very straightforward solution to all these ills, and one that can help solve a lot of other issues at the same time. It's straightforward, but it's not easy. It's economic equality. As it happens, wisdom traditions have been speaking about and acting on this issue for millennia. Roger often asks me to speak about Buddhism, and I can't blame him. It's a wonderful tradition, and it's one that I feel very much at home within, and I'm happy for the place I have within the Buddhist community. And the Buddhist teachings and tradition has a lot of relevant things to say about greed, hatred, and delusion. But as I was re-immersing myself in this data this week, what kept coming to mind was not my Buddhist practice, but my Franciscan one. Francis and Clare lived during a time of economic and social upheaval, when artisans and merchants were rising in number and power, and the feudal system itself was in flux. They were acutely aware of the poverty and inequality that surrounded them, and they made it a point to fashion a spiritual practice and a community that sought to make space for a different way and a different world. The tradition tells us that one of Francis's own changes of heart came at a moment when he embraced a leper, and that's a story that you might have already heard. Francis had previously been disgusted by the disease and repulsed by those who suffered from it, and he wasn't the only one. Society then was in some ways parallel to society now, in that they had learned to tolerate inequality by dehumanizing the poor. When Francis was young, a drought had ravaged the land. Famine then combined with war, these nearly constant armed squabbles between cities and regions, which ruined both lives and livelihoods. Beggars were common enough, the fruit of inequality and violence. About 1/3 of the population lived in comparative poverty, and about 10% of the population was just barely surviving. And then there were the lepers. We don't have hard data, but many of the folks who were cast out as lepers in Francis's day were probably suffering from ergotism. It's a terrible affliction that's also known as St. Anthony's fire. It began with intestinal illness, and if it progressed, you would suffer shingles, eczemas, ulcers, and blackened skin. Then, as Esther Inglis Arkell describes it, quote, people would feel a prickling sensation in their arms or legs. This would turn to burning pain, and the arm would swell and redden before turning gangrenous and dropping off. You were lucky if the limb died without taking you with it. These folks were shunned. They were pushed out of society. They were forced to live in special asylums where they were, at best, reduced to objects of pity and charity. But what I don't want us to miss this morning, because that's a famous story, right, of Francis embracing the leper. What I don't want us to miss is the fact that ergot is contracted when someone eats grain that's infected with a particular virus, or a fungus, Medieval folks, they recognized that fungus. They recognized its characteristic black spur, and they didn't eat the grain that had ergot. More accurately, they didn't eat it unless they were so hungry that the choice was between eating infested grain or starving to death. When food was scarce, the ergot-infested grain was a gamble. It was a known risk. It could keep you alive to beg another day. When Francis got down from his horse that day to hug the leper, or when he paused to give his cloak to a beggar, he was not just overcoming his personal aversion to a disease. Francis was rejecting an entire system that divided and dehumanized us. Francis intuitively knew that the problems in rich countries are not caused by society not being rich enough, but by those divides of income and economic inequality that pushed us further and further away from one another. What matters is where we stand in relation to others in our society. And Francis knew that intuitively, and he dedicated his life to being on an equal footing with the poor and insisting that following Jesus meant radical equality. He worked as a manual laborer. He begged. He refused to own property, and his followers did the same. Most of you know that I'm a member of the Order of Ecumenical Franciscans, a community of folks committed to living lives that embody values such as justice, peace, simplicity, and humility. The eighth principle of our general rule is this: Jesus chose for himself a poor and humble life, even though he valued created things attentively and lovingly. Let the Order of Ecumenical Franciscans seek a proper spirit of detachment from temporal goods by simplifying our own material needs. We shall strive to purify our hearts from every tendency and yearning for possession and power. Over the years of my involvement with this group, I have learned in a way that I hadn't known before that this is the kind of spiritual and cultural practice that can create a space where we can experience true equality and a place where vital connections can thrive. It may be a hard word for those of us to hear who enjoy privilege and relative luxury, but I don't think there's any way around it. We've developed an entire culture around the accumulation of wealth and power by dehumanizing humans and the earth, exploiting them and then discarding them. Oppressive systems, a system, say, like white supremacy, won't go away until we can purify our hearts from every tendency and yearning for possession and power. Because giving up privilege and wealth, real or perceived or aspirational, will always be a stumbling block. The same goes for all of our oppressive systems. We can't pretend otherwise. Inasmuch as we cling to possession and power, we cling to inequality, and we create conditions that choke out community. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about vital connections in preparation for a conference in August. We're going to be dancing, singing, playing, drumming, drinking, eating, laughing, and sharing life together, and it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be fun and refreshing, and it should help us keep building trust and community. It's important that we do those things because they're part of our resilience, how we can keep going when things feel so bad. We need to do things like this that can help us sustain us for the work of change. But the goal is not that we all become incredible singers and dancers. I can guarantee you I will never be an incredible dancer. That's not the goal. The goal is to empower us to fashion a more just, compassionate society. That's the goal. We need an end to economic inequality. Just pause to read this tweet. Money can't buy happiness means the mindless accumulation of excess wealth ultimately leads to diminishing returns on happiness. That's what we mean when we say, or what we should mean when we say money can't buy happiness. What it should never mean is that poor people should learn to be content without basic necessities or financial security. So money can't buy happiness. We don't want a temporary fix. We don't want something that just helps us pass the time and accommodate injustice. So let's sing and dance together. Let's eat and laugh together. Let's make art and tell stories. Let's make vital connections. Let's do all of these wonderful things. But let's also be intentional about doing so in a way that dismantles oppressive systems, that dismantles white supremacy, that tramples the patriarchy, and, in the words of the dear mother of Jesus, the way she put it, that sends the rich away empty and pulls the mighty from their thrones. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.